The following is a segment from the Carl King Podcast. If you enjoy this show, be sure to like, subscribe, and send us burritos. If you're new to this, here are the rules. Number 1, I watch a movie, or film, and take notes as I'm watching it. And 2, I attempt to extract useful filmmaking lessons from it. And 3, I share them with you. So up first, we have Wargames from 1983, directed by John Badham, written by Walter F. Parks and Lawrence Lasker. Lasker also wrote Project X, also starring Matthew Broderick, and Helen Hunt from 1987. I looked it up, and the budget for Wargames was $12 million, but grossed $125 million worldwide, and it was nominated for 3 Academy Awards. So, it's always a surprise to me when the writers of such successful movies don't seem to go on to have more of their writing produced. But that's the speculative nightmare that is screenwriting or any kind of filmmaking. It's like, why should I hire you? What did you do? Well, I wrote a movie that made 10 times its budget. Now, can I have another job? Well, no. So, even successful directors and screenwriters might never get hired again. And I'm not so confident it's the best way for the movie industry to be structured. It's a revolving door of creative people who might get to make only one successful movie before disappearing, and replaced by new people with even less experience. I also saw that Wargames came out the same year as Return of the Jedi, and Ferris Bueller was 3 years later in 1986. So that gives you a bit of the historical context for this film, or movie. Now check this out. This was only Matthew Broderick's second movie role, and it looks like this was the movie that was his breakthrough. Because since then, he has starred in somewhere around 80 films. Can you imagine that? 80 films? Well, according to the website Collider, that's actually nothing, because Danny Trejo has been in over 400. So some quick math says if you watch Danny Trejo's movies 24 hours a day and didn't sleep, it would take something like a month to get through them all. Or you could watch one of his movies every day for a year and still not get through them. I don't know what you would look like if you did something like that, but let me know if you do. Send me photos. According to Letterboxd, Danny Trejo has only been acting for about 40 years, which means he's been in 10 movies a year? Well, someone likes being in movies. Can you imagine being in that many movies? How much sweating and waiting around in a condemned building that is? But as Mark Borchardt says, you gotta make that craft services table work for you. Anyway, back to Wargames. Let's look at some more context. Both Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy were about 21 at the time. And this was 2 years before Sheedy was in Breakfast Club, 1985, by John Hughes. And Sheedy also went on to star in Short Circuit after this one, 3 years later with the same director. No Disassemble. Now, here's some story analysis. The opening scene for Wargames was expert level. And by that, I mean this. While there is dialogue happening, there is no dialogue at all to suggest what is happening or where they are. Everything we need to know is entirely visual. The only dialogue happening is nonsense small talk, like you'd have as anyone is clocking in and out of a job. But this is no ordinary day job. A less crafty screenwriter could have made the characters speak the plot. For example, they could have said, I hate being down in this top secret missile control room in charge of launching nuclear weapons. Gosh, I hope a nuclear war doesn't break out. But instead, on the way down in the elevator, one of the guys is talking about what seems to be marijuana? because the small talk is so vague and personal, I didn't even entirely follow it. And some of the other workers criticized them for being a bit late to work, which was also non-exposition. And I have to take a moment here to point out an unexpected detail in this scene. When the two guys are going into the control room, there's a sign on the wall. And it says, "Anyone urinating in this area will be discharged." Now, this is deep within an underground top-secret military base in maybe New Mexico? Do they not have a bathroom? Do the military personnel have to hold their pee-pee for 24 hours in there? And do people urinate right there in that spot frequently? Enough to warrant an actual sign on the wall? But think about it this way. This was a film set, so it was entirely intentional. Like, it was someone's job to go and make that sign and put it there. And it was a prominent sign. I think anyone who watches this movie probably sees it. So, whose idea was that? And why did they do it? I have no clue. Anyway, the scene ends a few minutes later on a tense moment with one guy holding a gun to the other guy's head. And we can assume what happened, or actually what didn't happen after that. But it's such a skillful opening scene from start to finish. Possibly the best scene of the whole movie. So then we meet our protagonist, played by Matthew Broderick, and there's nothing that unusual or memorable about him. He's just a clever teenage computer hacker, and that's all we need to know, I guess. But what struck me was the detail put into Ali Sheedy's character. Either the writer or director, instead of just making her a generic female sidekick, wrote her as physically active and even athletic, which was a good contrast to the hacker nerd. I'll go through some examples of her physically active personality, because first she shows up on a moped. And I'm thinking, well, that's different. And she gives our nerdy hero a ride home from school on it. Well, that's a strong choice because it could have been a car, but they went for something different. And the second time she goes over to his house, she had been out jogging. And when we see her again, she's doing some kind of workout in leotards. I think later in the movie she mentions that she was scheduled to do some dancing on TV of some sort. Now, this was all a good bit of character detail. And if you think about it, it had nothing to do with the plot. She never uses her athleticism to solve a problem, or save the day, or move things forward in any way. It seems to have been there simply to make Ali Sheedy's character more real. So this is where I start to wonder, was this all left in there from a previous draft of the screenplay? Was her physicality originally plot-related, but now it served no purpose? Were they like, it seems cool, let's just keep it? It's possibly what happened. So, anyway, now we deal with some geographical anomalies. Both she and Matthew Broderick's character live in Seattle, Washington. So the story goes like this. After hacking into NORAD a few times, he gets arrested by the FBI outside his local 7-Eleven. But I'm wondering, why would the FBI stake out a 7-Eleven? Like, there are undercover FBI dudes all around the convenience store waiting for him. Like, pretending to read the newspaper and wearing dark sunglasses. And when they approach him, they already know his name. And even though he's probably a minor, they don't even tell his parents. They just throw him into a van and drive off. Now, I suppose maybe if the FBI had to go to his house, it would legally bog down the film since his parents would then be involved, and they'd probably take his parents in too, and that would just make the whole movie too complicated. We just have to get this guy from scene A to scene B, okay? Anyway, they bring him in for questioning, but where do they take him? They take him to one of the most important military structures in the U.S., NORAD, in Colorado, the same base he just hacked into. And by the way, NORAD is a 16-hour drive from Seattle, and I'm assuming they took him by car? It's possible they flew him there, although there's no evidence either way. And after some fun and games, he soon escapes NORAD, and he hitchhikes to Grand Junction, which is halfway across the state, 300 miles away. And he decides he needs to get from Grand Junction, Colorado, to Salem, Oregon, to try and find the inventor of the computer he hacked into. So what does he do? He calls Ali Sheedy, a 17-year-old high school girl whom he just met maybe the day before, and says, "Hey, can I borrow some money? Just send me some money to the airport and I'll pick it up there." And what does she do? She shows up there. She came from Seattle, and she says, "Oh, don't worry, it was only a 3-hour drive." But it should have been more like 16 hours. I guess that's depending on how fast you drive, but it's about 1,100 miles. And I assume that might have taken a bit longer, actually, on her moped. So then they fly all the way back west to Salem, Oregon, which would be a 16-hour drive in that direction. So I guess she leaves her moped there in Grand Junction. Then they travel by bus and ferry to a place called Goose Island, which is another few hours away. And when they get there, they find the scientist they were looking for, and his house is an outrageous set because he has tall succulents inside his living room, which is pretty hard to believe that those could survive in there. Then again, he's a scientist, so who knows what that guy is capable of? After some arguing, the scientist just doesn't want to help save the world, so the two kids leave. And since they missed the ferry, and it's now late at night, Ali Sheedy suggests they swim the 2 to 3 miles back to the Oregon mainland. Because she's super athletic. And Matthew Broderick's character admits to her that he doesn't know how to swim. Now, what does this have to do with the plot? Nothing. Maybe this stuff, like I said before, was related to a previous scene that got cut out, and maybe this was all set up in a previous version of the screenplay where Ali Sheedy would save him from drowning. I don't know. But it does end up serving as a character texture, because now we know more about Matthew Broderick's character other than he is a hacker that wears a hoodie. Aside from that detail, there's really not much else to him. So let's get back to our geographical anomalies here. As Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy do a kissing scene, a helicopter appears and chases them. So after some wasted time running around in circles, we learn the scientist himself is piloting the helicopter. Now, he could have just walked out into his yard and said, "Hey guys, you know what? You're right. Let's go stop a nuclear war. And hey, I can get us to NORAD. I have this helicopter." Because yeah, he has his own NORAD helicopter with the logo on it and everything. So he flies them back to NORAD again. But this time it would have been 1,300 miles. And that made me wonder, what is the range on a typical helicopter anyway? Google says it's about 250 miles. So if they flew there, they would probably have to refuel maybe 4 or 5 times, which is totally possible. Anyway, I assume he was flying them straight to NORAD in the helicopter, but then in the next scene when they arrive, it's by Jeep. So then I was curious, well, what happened in between the helicopter and the Jeep? How does one go about flying a helicopter into NORAD? Is that allowed? Because when he arrives, they didn't even seem to know he was coming. But you know what? In the end, does any of that affect the story? Does anyone watching the movie care about it? Nope, only Carl King does. So maybe the filmmaking lesson to be extracted is, when you're writing a film like this, don't get so bogged down in those sorts of tiny details. Unless you really want to. Now, when I write my screenplays, I really do try to get all of those things exact. I worry about the physics and how long it takes to get from one location to another, and can an apocalyptoraptor really run as fast as a plane? I might pick up on more logical errors and implausibilities, but I'm sure I miss some of them too. As a writer, it can give you some relief to work in these broad strokes, and maybe it doesn't matter if you get all the little geographical details correct, because it's just a story. That is, unless those details really stand out as implausible or straight up impossible. As long as those sorts of details stay below the conscious threshold, the illusion of the film is maintained. But here's something I appreciated. The ending has a moral of the story, that nuclear war is unwinnable. And that was a big statement to make back in 1983. So I gave this movie 5 out of 5 stars on Letterboxd. If you enjoyed this segment from the Carl King podcast, remember, you can also listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or through an old rubber hose.